So we got about 10 minutes left, and Chassidy, Jay, and I wanted to throw it open to you guys for questions, thoughts, perspectives, anything that you guys want to talk about. It can be history, it can be pedagogy. I've got some questions for you guys. So if we don't have volunteers, I will do the teacher thing. But if there's anything on y'all's minds or perspectives that you guys wanted to ask about, now is an open floor. You can just unmute yourself and ask away.
I kind of had a question. I also teach US history, and we were kind of talking about the titans of industry. And I
Hmm.
was always kind of curious about, through your perspective, why Texas was never as big as like Andrew Carnegie's oil. Like, why do you think there wasn't ever like a monopoly on cotton? I mean, like you touched on it earlier, why cattle ended up not being a monopoly, which makes a lot of sense. But I was just curious at why you think cotton, which was so important in the South and ended up being a major producer in Texas. What were your thoughts on that?
That's an interesting question. I've never thought about that before, but that's perfect for the time frame we're talking about. Because when I teach the U.S. history survey, we talk about, Rockefeller with Standard Oil, Carnegie, Vanderbilt with the railroads, steel. That's Carnegie, obviously. Yeah, where they like monopolize all these different industries and kind of control them in all sorts of ways. Part of that happens when it does because the oil industry, I mean, there have been oil since basically since dinosaurs, but like as an industry, it really emerged in the late 19th, early 20th century. And so, Rockefeller, he starts in, I think it's Cleveland, but he starts, he has his own refinery plant, and then he starts buying others, and then he muscles everybody else out, but he just consolidates the industry. Carnegie does the same thing because the development of steel really kind of comes to its form in the late 19th century that helps push a lot of expansion of building in New York and other places like that. Cotton's just too old. It's been around for too long. There was no monopolizing that necessarily. The seeds were out there, and you really just couldn't scoop them all up and bring them back. You didn't need like industry for refinement or technology for steel development, things like that that you could more. It was harder for average people to get, and that's why cotton is very accessible. Cattle was very accessible. The 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 water holes on the plains were not necessarily, and that's what kind of creates a sort of mini monopoly on the cattle drives and things like that. Um, but that's a really great question, Krista. I had not thought of it in that way before. Um, the thing about Texas is it's all extractive industries. And that's what's true of the South throughout most of this period. The same thing can be said for the timber in East Texas. There's just a lot of trees, and everybody owns different parts of that land, so every one of them's competing with each other. Unless somebody comes in and buys all of the East Texas piney woods, um, the lumber companies can just go buy from anyone else around there, and it makes it hard to monopolize. I think a lot of the technology
Okay.
aspect of oil, the railroads, and things like that, steel in particular,
Okay.
allow for that kind of concentration.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
I had a question.
Shoot, please.
So you mentioned early on that they would just go round up the feral cattle. How did the sorry, how did they originally get there? You're okay. How did they originally get there? And I guess their numbers exploded as we left them alone. Where did they come
Oh,
from?
yes. Where do they come from? I love this question. My students, when I teach the Texas survey, I've usually got 150 students, and I'll say something about 3.7 million cattle, and someone will put their hand up and always say, like, wait, how? How are there that many cattle? And so my joke is always, well, when a mommy cow and a daddy cow love each other very much, like it's just the feral cattle that are out there. The Spanish had been actually running cattle in South Texas for a long time, and so you've got different breeds that have been brought in that are crossbreeding, and you've got a feral kind of version of that comes out with the Texas Longhorn. And so it's just like wild horse herds as well. A lot of it really comes down to the basics of the plains are just very conducive for grazing. And so the same reason the bison are, increasing in numbers until all the bison hunting happens at this exact same time You have cattle that's been running around out there. The difference is, so we talked about last week, is that with all those bison being killed off, when 3.5 million of them getting killed off, that opens up massive amounts of grasslands for cattle. And so the cattle actually explode in numbers because they're no longer competing for resources out on the plains because the bison are being killed off. So it's a lot of that kind of phenomenon.
Thank you.
Hi, hello.
Hello, Joshua.
Hi, yeah, this is my first year teaching Texas history, so yay. I
Welcome to the
finally made
party.
it in. It was a long time coming. But this is going to next talking about road expansion. We're at my school that we're talking about that next week. So this is perfect for me. I'm like right on it. My question to you is and I'm sorry if it sounds like a newbie question to y'all.
No, please don't shy
but
whatsoever.
but on the railroad expansion in Texas, the Chinese immigrants that come in there, how big of an impact did they have on the Texas expansion of the railroad?
Most of the Chinese labor that's being used on railroads is further west.
Yeah.
It's mostly California and then moving eastward from California. That's
Hmm.
where the vast majority of that happens. I'm not going to say categorically it didn't happen in Texas. I've never seen anything about that happening in Texas itself. The way that railroad expansion happened in Texas mostly, and this is true of a lot of southern states too, is that the state of Texas would actually give land to railroad companies to give them incentive to build railroads and kind of underwrite them, basically giving them free land. That way, the investment by the railroad wasn't as risky because they had land that they could sell and they would have value out of that land. And as the railroad became successful, the land would become more valuable because more people are going back and forth on it, and therefore it becomes more. It's like giving land for building I-10. It's whatever company is going to build I-10 if the state wasn't doing it. You get the land, you build I-10, and then when all the businesses want to put in strip malls next to it, you get to sell the land to them and make money. So the state kind of underwrote a lot of railroad development, but it was a lot of different railroads. It wasn't like just one railroad like the Union Pacific. It was a whole bunch of different railroads, some small ones, some big ones. A lot of them failed because they were little, not adventures, but ventures of investment and things like that. And they're all doing different gauges and different widths. And so the railroads in Texas are a hot mess for a long time, as is true of the rest of the country until they moved to standardized gauge as well. But there's not a lot of Chinese labor that's happening on the railroads in Texas. There's a lot of African American labor, Mexican American labor, and then poor white labor as well that's happening on there. But it's not being underwritten by the way that like the Union Pacific was with Chinese labor out west.
Thank you. That cleared up a lot of questions on my personal end.
Yeah, that's a great question. I've never been asked that question in 15 years I've been doing Texas stuff. So it's a really good one, but I've not seen anything about the Chinese labor in Texas. Oh, I see Ashley put in the chat there about 300 Chinese laborers helped build the Southern Pacific from LA to El Paso. And so they end up in El Paso. So there you go. This is and that was something I hadn't known before. So I have to look into that. So thank you, Ashley, for sharing that. That's fascinating. My parents are from Southern California, so I've read quite a bit about the railroads coming out. My grandfather actually worked for the Union Pacific. And so I've seen quite a bit about that, but I didn't realize that connection at the Southern Pacific to El Paso.
Yeah, it's cool that Ashley brought that up because I was gonna mention that because I'm from El Paso. I work here in San Antonio, but I'm Chinese Mexican. So my great grandfather was a Chinese immigrant working on the railroad. When there was a lot of issues with just xenophobia, went to Mexico, built his family there, and so it's cool that I got to write my master's thesis on that. So it's cool to share that like with my students and like what like Chinese Mexican. I was like, yeah, like it's a thing. Like I promise you. I did research, so it's just really cool to see Ashley bring that up as well because it adds a lot more nuance to like the history of the borderlands for sure. So
That's fascinating. There's some really great books that have been written about the Chinese labor experience in California in particular, but also this crossover, as you've said, of cultures between the Hispanic, Latino cultures and Chinese groups and immigrants in Southern California in particular, some in Arizona and New Mexico. I haven't seen any work done on Texas, but obviously there is some work to be done there, which is why it's fascinating to be a historian, because we haven't written everything and we haven't figured out stuff, right? Remember when I told my mom I was going to be a historian? She's like, well, honey, we kind of know everything that happened. And it's like, no, not quite. There is a lot more to be done. And because of resources like the portal, which has seen quantities of historical newspapers and things like that, like we're discovering stuff all the time in terms of documentation to allow us to see more deeply into things like that. So I think there's at least a master's thesis, if not a dissertation, to be written on this topic alone. So Joshua and Lorenzo, I want to see you guys working on that. All right. By next week, we're looking for an outline and a bibliography.
sounds good.
Oh, Kamiko says there's a book on Asian Texans that explores this history. Okay, we're having a whole session next week. We're just putting aside cotton, people. We're going to dive into this.
There you go, Lorenzo. We'll trade information and we'll get working on that.
All right, guys. It's probably a good play. We're at 6:30. I don't want to keep you guys after time. You guys have busy lives and families, so we're gonna pause for today. We're gonna come back next week. We're gonna pick up the story.